I think it was more than 10 years ago that I wrote a blog posted on the main Wood Heat site about the relationship of woodchuck to the fire. And I was reading through those blogs and decided it would be good to actually read that blog aloud along with an adjacent blog, and then follow that up with some comments of things that we've learned in the last 10 years or so about woodchuck. Donna Lee, at the end of each round of the sweat lodge, would cry out, "Firekeeper, open the door, please." And the outside person, the man or woman entrusted for the evening with the sacred tasks of carrying rocks, keeping the fire hot, and all matters of protection and ceremony outside the lodge, would throw open the flap, and all the sweat-covered participants inside would gulp in huge amounts of the cooling fresh air. The sweat lodge is a sacred space. Wood that grew from the gifts of the light and warmth of Father Sun, and the gifts of the water and minerals from the Earth Mother, sacrifices itself in the fire. Fire heats the rocks in the fire. The rocks are passed into the lodge with a hay fork, brushed off with an evergreen branch, and set in place by the lodge leader with a pair of deer antlers. Each round of the sweat lodge brings in more hot rocks as the heat slowly builds and the powerful experience of the sweat lodge deepens and for many sweetens. The rock people, as Native Americans refer to them, sacrifice themselves for the sweat and the prayers and the tears and the songs and the stories that are shared and sent off in the dark to powers greater than us all. The rock people are the oldest nation with the deepest memory. These memories, too, can be released for the benefit of all in the lodge. The sweat lodge is a healing space. Well run, a sweat lodge can offer great solace to those who suffer in body, emotions, and spirit. Sweating releases toxins from the body, but the spiritual energy present in a lodge can also release spiritual and emotional toxins for those present, and even for those far away, held in the hearts and prayers of those present. Indeed, the sweat lodge is often called a prayer lodge. The fire outside breathes. The rocks inside the lodge breathe and sigh and crackle as they give up their life for those present. The lodge participants gasp and breathe, filling their lungs with the heat and the steam created when the leader pours water on the rocks, with courage and prayer and song. As children, we all learned the poem about the woodchuck long before we knew anything about burning or splitting or carrying and stacking firewood. We brought the woodchuck into our hearts and minds before we knew how to make fire with wood. In my garden, just outside the portable chicken fence, we stacked in the fall of 2008 a double row of split wood on half-cord pallets. Each pallet sat off the ground on long, recycled, creosoted railroad beams discarded from an old crossing. When I tried to grow sacred Wabanaki rose corn in my garden, I noticed in the spring of 2009 that all 5 varieties of my sweet peas were being methodically pruned to the ground as they emerged. Once the peas were finished, I noticed a similar phenomenon occurring on a small row of soybeans. Once the peas and beans were finished, my late planted Wabanaki rose corn began to show signs of an intruder, and every third or fourth newly sprouted seed was being pulled up, and the sprout was being eaten, and the leaves gently discarded in a row to the side. I realized then that the culprit was a woodchuck, living under the woodpile, where we already know that woodchucks do chuck wood. Live traps were ineffective, but my sacred corn was at risk, so I pulled up all the pea fence and laid the pea fence and chicken wire around the Wabanaki rose patch, and then piled last year's corn husks all around the base of the fence, and then hung sweetgrass in each corner and started peeing on the perimeter whenever I had a chance. My efforts worked, and although the woodchuck stayed under the woodpile, the corn had a chance to get underway. The roadside woodchuck, it turns out, is a connoisseur. It knows immediately what is the sweetest or the best, and that is what it eats. 30 years ago, around my second garden, worked first by a pig tractor, pigs in a portable pen, and then by hand, I buried a wire mesh fence 18 inches deep in the ground and 4 feet high to keep out the woodchucks. Sharing freely or asking the dogs for protection or killing woodchucks with a long-handled shovel in a rage of madness seemed a lot more unpleasant and challenging than building a woodchuck-proof fence. Once the fence was built and the 3 dogs left on perimeter patrol, we never had a woodchuck problem again for 30 years until the current dogs began to age and the Wabanaki rose was planted. Perhaps the woodchuck remembered the Wabanaki people and its genes, because it turns out that the woodchuck was the chosen firekeeper of the Norridgewock people who lived on the corn-growing floodplains where the Sandy and Kennebec rivers merge about a mile above our home. They grew corn there for hundreds of years. Woodchucks still live all around the borders of these fields, as well as along all the main highways, but almost everyone has forgotten the firekeeper role the woodchuck used to play. Corn still grows on the floodplains of the Sandy and Kennebec and Norridgewock and up and down both rivers. The corn grown today is primarily cow corn for milk production. The corn the native people grew was flint corn, perhaps related to the Wabanaki rose variety of corn that I've planted. When the first European explorers met native people at the mouth of the Kennebec, they were told that corn was being grown on fields far up the river. It is very likely that these were the fields around Norridgewock and its surrounds. Father Sebastian Rall, who lived with the Norridgewocks for 30 years and wrote a French Wabanaki dictionary, now at Harvard, wrote to his brother in France that he survived primarily on a corn gruel or porridge sweetened with maple sugar. The majority of the Norridgewocks, sadly, and Father Rall were massacred in 1724 in a planned assault on the village by British-American forces during the French and Indian War. Before European contact, the Norridgewocks had no matches or flint and steel, but this technology was introduced with European muskets, which used black powder and a steel striker hitting a chip of flint set in the gun. Flintlock rifles. Before the Europeans came, and before the guns came, the Norridgewock had fire and a fire carrier, a fire keeper, the woodchuck. I've been reading all winter on the Norridgewocks, the Penobscots, and other native people of Maine, who are all sometimes referred to as Abenaki or Wabanaki people. One translation is that these are people of the dawn, the easternmost people and the first to see the sun each day. In my own exploration of fire and fire making and understanding the spirit of fire, I have made my own bow drill, gathered my own tinder, and I now know that I can make fire anywhere from available materials without a match or a butane lighter. It just takes a little time to find the right materials and put them together. A cedar branch is often curved and makes a good bow. A cedar board split makes a good fireboard. A spindle can be carved from a piece of dried branch. I have used oak, maple, and cedar branches successfully. Tinder can be a mouse nest, or fine yellow birch bark, or the inner bark of poplar and other fine dry materials. A good spark catcher under the board is a flat stone or a flat piece of birch bark. Sometimes there is no time, and having a ready fire at hand is crucial to one's survival. I remember as a boy boiling paraffin on the kitchen cook stove and dipping kitchen matches in the paraffin to make a waterproof set of matches for our Boy Scout camping trips. One of my favorite camping tools was a red plastic match holder with a whistle on one end and a compass on the other. Over the years, I have started many ceremonial first fires in our masonry heaters with my bow drill kit. Sometimes it takes a long time and a big effort, but it is always worth the effort because of the magic and power of making fire with your own hands and putting the fire in the masonry heater that was also handmade. Although the masonry heater was paid for by my clients, the masonry heater is also a true gift to the home and the people who live there. It becomes the heart of the home, and this is where the fire lives. It lives in the heart. The real luxury of fire is to be able to carry it with you, ready at any moment to spring into life. The ancient people who lived here had that capability with their ally, the woodchuck. When a woodchuck was killed and eaten, its skin was saved whole, turned inside out and scraped and tanned. The skull was removed and cleaned, but was then reinserted in the woodchuck skin, now turned right side out again. The skull became one half of the weight of the woodchuck firekeeper's bag, and the other half of the bag, the half that hung over the belt or thong around the person's waist or in their knapsack or pack basket, two matched surf clam shells were inserted. Inside the shells was a filling of soft marine clay, still readily available in Norwich Walk, 3 feet down in places on our property, or easily dug in the gravel pit next door. With the shells open, a long spiral was carved into the clay, and into the spiral was placed a fuse made, I am told, of the degraded fungal wood of the yellow birch. Lit at one end and closed within the shells, the fuse could slowly burn all day, so that when the woodchuck firekeeper bag arrived at the next campsite, the fire was immediately at hand the minute the live spark was added to local tinder and small branches, and somebody blew on the tinder and the spark in the fungus. I've read about this technique of carrying fire in clay-lined clamshells with a fungal wood fuse spiraled in the shell for many years, but only this year did I learn about the woodchuck's critical role as the bag and skull counterweight, enabling it to be a true fire keeper for the local people. I have pulled wood out of the ground that has been invaded by a fungus that turned the wood blue and caused it to glow at night if freshly turned up from the ground. But I have never met anyone who has the whole kit and who has used it someone who has turned the woodchuck from a garden enemy into an ally and firekeeper. I know where to get the shells. I know the woodchuck as a neighbor and connoisseur. I have gifted trapper and skinning friends. I have skinned my own fair share of deer and moose and a bear and tanned a few hides. I have a bucket of large quahog shells in my garage for wampum purposes. They will probably suffice, but there are larger surf clams at the ocean's edge available at any low tide. I have the clay. Yellow birch has agreed to be my ally, and we are good friends. I do not know yet how to gather and prepare the fungal wood and turn it into a fuse, and I have met no one who does know, but I trust that I one day will. We are all fire keepers at heart. The heart and the hearth is where the fire lives and is happy. When we are happy, we are one with the fire. Now, it wasn't long after I wrote and published that blog that I did a follow-up blog, and that blog documented some of what I had learned in the time after the first blog. One day after posting the Woodchuck Firekeeper blog, I knew I had to find an answer to the birch tinder fungus question and mystery. And so on a blue moon, the day before New Year's Eve, I called my friend Ray Wrightsey, who has taught wilderness ways and skills at the Earthways School of Wilderness Living for decades. Ray lives with his wife Nancy in a handmade, off-the-grid, wood-heated log cabin, Hogan, in Canaan, Maine. When I called, both Nancy and Ray were home. Nancy, who answered the call, was sure there were lots of ways to carry fire, and she eventually hooked me up with Ray. I told him about the spiral, fuse, and a clay body inside of clamshells, and added my Woodchuck Firekeeper news. I also told him about the wonderful new book by Carrie Hardy, which is a field guide to the Maine Wabanaki people in the period just before and during early European contact. The book, Notes on a Lost Flute, is full of wonderful tales, photos, drawings, and detective stories on unraveling the original meaning of many of the Indian place names in Maine, including Norridgewock, where we've lived for over 35 years. The original prehistoric village of Norridgewock is built at the confluence of the Sandy River, which flows out of the western mountains near Rangeley, and the Kennebec River, which originates in Maine's largest lake, Moose Head. When the Sandy tries to enter the strong current of the Kennebec, it can't simply enter that traffic pattern of water. Instead, it has to flow north, upstream, along the western bank of the river of the Kennebec before it can ease into the downstream southerly flow of the river. This image of a river flowing in two directions at the same time and in the same place is the meaning embedded in the name Norridgewock. I have read attempts to decipher the meaning of the name for 40 years, and it is Hardy's explanation that has me won over. I really like Hardy's book. When Ray Wrightsey was a boy, he was befriended by a Micmac Indian elder who Ray refers to as grandfather. Grandfather taught Ray many of the old woods ways and the deeper connections to the natural world. And Ray has passed this same deep connection to the natural world onto his hands-on wilderness students for years. Grandfather taught Ray that spruce is the keeper of the spark. I asked Ray what he meant by that, and Ray said that in the matter of a bow drill spindle, many woods have been tried, but the best one to make a spark is a spindle made of spruce. With a spruce spindle, and a good fireboard underfoot, and spindle cover piece nestled in the palm of one's hand, and good tinder ready at hand to receive the coal, spruce could reliably provide the spark to make a fire. I told Ray about the clay and clamshells and some kind of fungal fuse associated with birch, and Ray knew exactly what I was referring to, and had learned this as well from grandfather, that, quote, tinder fungus is the keeper of the fire, unquote. Ray says that tinder fungus is a jagged black fungus that grows on white birch and yellow birch. When collected, dried, and lit from another fire, it will smolder and glow, but not leap into flame. It can be made into a fuse and packed into fairly dry clay, perhaps as a spiral fuse, and carried lit all day. Ray had done it with conch shells and clay with a lit tinder birch fuse in the middle and the two shells tied together and carried in a pack basket, perhaps with a basket in a canoe. Ray said that the glowing fuse is so strong that you cannot make it go out unless you cut the glowing part out with a knife and submerge it in water. After I spoke with Ray, I went online and Googled tinder fungus and found literally hundreds of entries, including a short video on the birch tinder fungus. I had just finished the video when a knock on the door came from a man from New Zealand who had been calling me for 3 days about a visit to talk about masonry heaters. His wife was wearing a beautiful green stone pendant hung on a finely knotted leather or fiber necklace of Maori handwork. This would have been jade. Charles and his wife said that Maori natives of New Zealand also carried fire with them when they moved around, and he would research this for me as soon as they got home. Charles may be coming to the New Zealand hands-on workshop in early February 2010. He wants to develop a low-cost, sustainable masonry heater design and system for New Zealand. We spent quite a lot of time together in the kitchen, showing them the first finished brick cook stove that I ever built about 30 years ago. It still works beautifully. In one day, asking for answers to the tinder fungus mystery, 2 people came into my life with more stories of carrying and keeping the fire. The deeper we connect to the ancient wisdom of the woodchuck, the spruce, and the tinder fungus, the more likely it is that we will finally remember what we have nearly completely forgotten how to do, how to live gently on this magical home called Earth. I think we can call this part 2 of the woodchuck firekeeper story. That was from 2 blogs that I wrote in 2009 or 2010, I think. And here we are now in the beginning of 2022. And a lot of things have happened, and there's been a lot of learning, a lot of masonry heaters, but there are stories to add about the tinder fungus and woodchuck and fire. Here is a piece of the tinder fungus that grows on the side of white birch and yellow birch called chaga. It's also a medicinal plant, a medicinal fungus. And what happens is a birch tree either white or yellow, will be damaged, often by a hatchet blaze marking a trail. And a friend of mine, Jimmy Cornish, was looking for land down in the Pownell area, and he was walking a line between one town and the other that was a line of yellow birch trees. And the line was marked with I think it had been done with a hatchet or axe years ago. And on every one of those marks on the trees, there was a chaga fungus growing, which of course could be harvested to turn into tinder fungus, but more likely today it could be turned into this wonderful source of a medicinal tea. This is a fairly large chunk, but I keep a chunk like this in a clear Corning pot on my cook stove, my wood-burning cook stove, which is now no longer a brick cook stove. I ultimately took that out and built a heavier, thicker-walled soapstone stove, which I'll share with you in a future video. And I just keep that in there, and as long as the liquid remains dark, I know that I'm still getting the nutrients that I want from the chaga. And I drink 2 or 3 cups of that a day. My friend Ray Reitze carries a thermos of chaga with him and sips from it all day long. It's antibacterial, antifungal, etc. And now it's being sold as powdered form in tea bags, and there are people that go out and make their living from harvesting and processing chaga. We go up to some old cabins up in the North Woods near Mount Katahdin, and I went up once up the river of the West Branch of the Penobscot with my friend Lizzie Hayes, and at the falls called Passamaquoddy Falls, we went into the forest, and there was a trail there, an old woods trail, and we were looking for the chaga, and she says, don't worry, Albie, I'll go ahead and I will sing for the chaga, and we will find some. And 5 minutes later, Lizzie called out and said, I found the chaga. And there it was, probably up 8 or 10 feet. And we were able to knock it loose with a long pole. And it was shaped like a hat, a conical hat about 8 inches tall. Often the chaga is very rough in form, but this was quite beautiful. And we brought it home and we sawed it in half, and I gave Lizzie half and I kept half, or she gave me half and she kept half. And so we had a good supply of chaga. And since then, I keep my open wherever I go in the woods for some, and I'm always able to collect a little when I want some. I was visiting a friend in town in Madison who has an antique shop, and I pulled in one day, and I was surprised to see on the side of his building, where he often displays things when he was open, a beautiful piece of sculpture. I hope you can see this. This is the largest chaga fungal growth that I've ever seen. And somebody collecting this today and grinding this into a powder to sell would have a very, very valuable piece of chaga. And you can see on the back that it was sawed off of the tree, probably with a chainsaw, because that's a really clean cut. And then it was saved. And my friend sold this to me for $25, and I keep it in the dining room to remember what the chaga is and to celebrate it, but also to celebrate the incredible beauty of this particular piece. When I went to see Ray about the chaga, he did a demonstration for me, and he basically had a small chunk the size of a walnut, and he lit it with a match or something, and he now had a live fuse. And then nothing we could do would put it out, and so the only way we could put it out was to submerge it in a pan of water, and then it fizzled and went out. So it's very clear that Chaga, I'm not sure it was done in a long spiral. I have a feeling that it could be carried with the protection of the dry clay so it wouldn't overheat simply inside of the shells, either a conch shell or clam shells or whatever shells were convenient, and tied with a rawhide thong and carried from campsite to campsite where that was your starter. And once you gathered the tinder, you didn't have to go through the tedious effort of a bow drill, and you could just get your next fire started. So it's a wonderful fire carrying tool, and it doesn't run out of butane fuel. It doesn't run out of flint. It's there in the woods, and once you've caught the fire and put it into the chaga, each time you leave and go to another spot, you have a fire carrying capability. And woodchuck seems to have played a part in this. There was a time a few years ago where I attended a 1.5-year course in something called plant spirit medicine, which was taught by a well-known teacher named Elliot Cohen. And he had befriended a group of native people in Mexico. And when he told them some of the dreams that he had been dreaming, he was there doing healing work with his acupuncture skills. And their eyes opened up, and they basically invited him to become part of them and to teach him their sacred ways, as if he was the one that was going to bring their sacred wisdom out into the world. As part of that sacred wisdom, the fire is central. And we were taught during the course of that 1.5 years how to work with fire, not as a tool that we could manipulate and play with and, toast marshmallows or burgers on, but as a sacred tool, where with a simple ritual, with gift offerings of sacred plants from Mexico, one could invite the Great Spirit, Grandfather Fire, to join the group. And just as in the Sweat Lodge, this becomes a place for sacred work to happen, for deep sharing to happen, for healing to happen, for wisdom to come, for humor to come, an incredible amount of humor. So over the years, I was thrilled to be able to find a small spot on my property where I could keep a sacred fire site. And many, many times I've gone out when I've needed that comfort and done a small sacred fire out there. There is a man who travels from sacred fire community to sacred fire community and teaches the wisdom of Grandfather Fire, often when he's in a trance, and these are stories told around the fire. And I was unable to attend one in Pennsylvania, where upwards of 100 people or more will come to participate and listen to the wisdom of Grandfather Fire as voiced through this suit, this body of a man who in this state of being is able to be the voice for Grandfather Fire. And a friend took elaborate notes from this evening. Notes are okay, tape recorders are not. And she read me some of these notes. And one of the stories that was told was that each Native American group had their own keeper of sacred plant wisdom, an animal that was a keeper of the sacred plant wisdom. And the Crow had some animal that instructed the Crow people in how to connect in a sacred way to find the medicine plants that were useful to them. And then the Eastern people, the Wabanaki, the Abenaki people, and this man had no reason, the suit had no reason to know about the Abenaki, but Grandfather Fire, of course, would. And he said the keeper of the plant wisdom of the Wabanaki people was Grandmother Woodchuck. And lo and behold, in researching this further, there are Wabanaki ancient oral teaching stories, and one of the teaching stories about the first being who preceded the first man and first woman. There are lots and lots of legends about this creature called Gluskab or Gluskabi. It's pronounced and spelled many different ways. And he was young when he showed up, and he was an orphan, and he needed to find somebody to take care of him. And the person who volunteered to take care of him was Grandmother Woodchuck. Gluskab was very headstrong, and he asked about tobacco. Where is the tobacco? And which is the sacred plant used as the bridge between humans, between humans and animals. If a person was to be a hunter, they might do ceremony and give the gift of tobacco to the spirit of the animal before they went hunting, and they would certainly give the gift of tobacco to the animal after it had been slain. And then it's also the bridge between humans and plants. This is also what Elliot Cohen taught in his plant spirit medicine course, that tobacco is an incredibly powerful plant with an incredibly powerful spirit, and when used in a sacred way, becomes the bridge between us as humans and the other nations, the plants, the animals, the rocks that we want to connect with. And I found that to be true in my own life. I actually grow a sacred tobacco that came as a gift from a recently deceased native Maine elder named Freda Paul, and he had received seeds from a man named Larry Lack. And Larry Lack had received the seeds when it was learned that an ancient grave had accidentally been dug up on a construction site on the north shore of Lake Superior. And in a tiny ceramic vial, sealed vial, they took this vial to the university in Guelph, Ontario, and opened it and examined it and did carbon testing on it. And the seeds were over 1,000 years old. And they were tiny, tiny, tiny black seeds. And they said, well, let's plant these and see if they're vital. And they planted them, and they were vital. And so those seeds eventually, some generations of those seeds came through Larry to Freda. Freda and Leslie gifted me with a light bulb box full of seed pods, literally hundreds of thousands of seeds. And I started growing those seeds, not to smoke recreationally, but because they were powerful and sacred. And for the last 10 or more years, I've grown that tobacco and given away those seeds again and again and again to people who wanted to use tobacco in a sacred way. So Grandfather Fire says that the Grandmother Woodchuck is the keeper of the plant wisdom, and Gluskab wants to get the tobacco back for the people, which in this case were all the other animals. And she says, well, grasshoppers stole the tobacco, and you mustn't try to get it back because it's very dangerous. And when people try to go and get the tobacco, he kills them. But Gluskab is very headstrong, as I understand the story, and he decides he's going to get it anywhere. And he builds a series of canoes until finally he has a canoe, maybe a stone canoe that's very strong and very fast. And he paddles across the lake to the place, I believe it's an island, where Grasshopper lives. And Grasshopper's fire is there, but he is not there. And Gluskab takes advantage of that and steals the tobacco and races back to Grandmother Woodchuck with the tobacco in hand. And Grasshopper shows up very, very angry and says, "Who stole my tobacco?" And Grandmother Woodchuck says to Grasshopper, she said, No, you stole the grasshopper from all the rest of the people, all the rest of the animals, and you now will never have the tobacco again, except when some person picks you up and you spit on their hand the tobacco juice that's in your mouth. So she then says, after the grasshopper has been dismissed, that Glooskap, when he wants to find a medicinal plant, should go into the woods and ask for the medicine plants to show themselves and to speak to him. And when a medicine plant does and says that it can help with the ailment that he's seeking to find help for, then the job is to use the tobacco and give it as a gift offering, as the bridge. And once he does that, then the plant gives permission to be picked and brought back and turned into medicine. So suddenly, we already knew that Grandmother Woodchuck here on my land is a connoisseur of plants. We later learned that Woodchuck is the carrier of fire. And now I learn that Woodchuck is the keeper of the plant wisdom. So even though every bone of the local gardener's body wants to argue for the woodchuck as a pest that's destroying the garden, what I had to wrap my head around was the woodchuck is a principal player and the keeper of the knowledge of what the plant world is all about and our relationship to it. And the woodchuck also played a key role in the keeper of the fire. So with that now in my head and under my belt, I had to rearrange my thinking about how I was relating to the natural world and how I was relating to fire and to the plants. And more recently, we grow 3 varieties of flint corn every year, one short season variety in our kitchen garden, and then a small crop of a new variety that we're trying to save. And then out on an upper field with the 5 acres of forest between us to protect us from pollen drift, we plant a larger field, and we keep planting and growing and saving more and more seed, which we then give back to native people and we give away to others. So we now have several varieties of flint corn, which we give away and try not to sell as a business, but sometimes are compensated for our efforts. So a couple of years ago, I went out to the field. It was too big to put a fence around, and I noticed once again the telltale behavior of some of the little seeds coming up through. When they are just sprouting, they are at their delectable peak for the woodchuck. And one by one, going down the rows, the woodchuck had pulled up the sprout, had bitten off the leaf, which is not what she or he wanted, and eaten the seed and had moved on. And I said, I can't fight this with a weapon. There's not enough urine to go around. Maybe prayer would help. And I had learned from a very wise biodynamic farmer that his wife had taught him how to relate to the marauding kangaroos on their ranch property in Australia when they had moved from the southern part of the United States to Australia. And she had first taught him that he could reach out with his thoughts to his cattle, and instead of calling them to come to the gate, he could reach out to them and tell them to be there at 5 o'clock, and he would open the gate and bring them across the road to the new pasture or to the barn. So he knew that something was working there. And every night he was going out like all the other ranchers and with his rifle and his Range Rover, and he would shoot kangaroos to try to keep the population down so that when they jumped over his pasture fence every night and fed on the grass, there would be enough grass left to harvest for hay for his cattle. But it was a losing battle, and one night he describes the story of a huge male kangaroo lit up in his headlights and stood there with his front legs up and his back on his back legs and his huge tail, and they just stared each other down with this man, I think his name was Hugh, with his rifle pointed at the kangaroo, and the kangaroo did not budge. And then the man remembered what his wife had taught him, And he said out loud, or in his mind, he said to the kangaroo, "I'd like to offer you a deal," in so many words. I will give you and your people, honoring them with the idea of being people, I will honor you and your people with this offer. If you will take just the first 100 or 300 feet, I can't remember which it was, inside of my pasture, and leave the rest alone, I will promise never to hunt your people again. And he went home that night and he told his wife. And he went out the next day and he could see that the kangaroos were still coming in, but over the following days and weeks, he noticed that they were not coming further into the field and the crop was maturing. And so he didn't hunt kangaroos anymore. He thought, well, maybe this is just a weird fluke. I'll go check with some of my neighbors. Maybe there's been a drop in the population. And he went to see his neighbors, and lo and behold, they were still going every night, and they were going out and shooting the kangaroos because there were more than ever. So remembering that story and thinking, what do I have to lose? And knowing that there are ways to communicate with plants through spirit, and there are ways to communicate with animals through spirit, I stood at the end of the field with tobacco and prayer. And I knew where there were live woodchuck burrows on the land. I had tripped and fallen into one quite recently. And so I asked the woodchuck if they would please leave the corn alone, how important the corn was to me and for the future of other people and for the giveaway. And I said, I'm not going to put up a fence. I'm not going to hunt and shoot you, but I would deeply appreciate it if you'd leave the corn alone. And over the next several days, I went out day after day, and I knew the woodchucks were still alive and well, but they stopped eating the corn. And so it seems like some communication, some magic understanding can happen when we approach the natural world from our hearts. So here we are now, into another story. We've learned more about chaga. We've learned more about the woodchuck. We've learned more about fire and the sacred nature of fire, the sacred nature of the animals and all the plants, most of which, other than the domesticated plants which we have, we've forgotten their value and how they can be used. But even those can be rediscovered by opening their hearts, using the tobacco and asking the right questions, and walking in a sacred way in the woods, as Glooskap was taught to do. Before I stop this piece, I want to show you Carrie's book. And it's now out of print, sadly, but there are still a few copies roaming around on the internet. And if you're interested in this history of the Wabanaki people as written by a non-native person, it's a great book to get. Carrie wrote back after reading my post, the one that I read to you earlier, and said the birch not only has the chaga fungus, but it has the conch fungus as well, which looks gray and layered and upside down, and it looks a little bit like a horse hoof upside down. And so that was also used as a fire-carrying tinder fungus by native people. But here's his book, Notes on a Lost Flute. The photo here is of a Penobscot woman that was taken many, many years ago. Here's a sturgeon, a wampum belt, a pipe, and there we have a sacred ear of flint corn. And throughout there's wonderful illustrations and maps, all designed and drawn by Carrie. He's now a close friend, and I've learned a lot from him, and we go clamming for those hen clams that were the carrying shells for the fungus down near Lincolnville. on a really, really low tide. When the tide sweeps out further than it normally does, there's a window of half an hour or an hour where you can dig for these clams with potato rakes and fill a 5-gallon bucket in 10 minutes. The real work is cleaning the clams when you get home and putting that food away in the freezer. I'll tell one final story about the fungus. I did a heater recently in Heartland, Maine, on a pond or a lake called Moose Pond. And it was a very steep slope covered with glacial erratic granite boulders. The family had been coming there for years after they'd bought the lot, and they were clearing the land of a lot of these boulders for the house that was going to be built. And so the tree line was back 40 or 50 feet in a semicircle around the house. And I noticed that in the process of clearing that, the heavy equipment, the earth moving equipment or the tree cutting equipment had damaged several of the yellow birch trees in that border around the property. And the family wasn't aware of it when I looked up over the course of 8 weeks building this elaborate project of a Rumford fireplace and a see-through masonry heater with heated benches. I noticed that chaga fungus had started to grow on every one of those scars. And over time, the chaga will pull that vital ingredient chemistry from the entire tree, and over the course of many, many years or decades, it eventually will create a huge chaga growth, and the tree itself will die. But that concentrated growth will then become a gift to the people that recognize it for its medicinal properties and for its fire-keeping properties.